My name is Bob Milligan, and I'm with the Creation Care Team at the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd. Creation Care teams at several local congregations, Good Shepherd, St. Philip's, Bethel Baptist, the Brevard Jewish Community, First United Methodist, St. Timothy's Methodist, and the Unitarian Universalists of Transylvania County, have collaborated to produce a fall speakers series with presentations focusing on climate change and its impact on the local environment. Before introducing tonight's topic and speaker, I want to mention that on Tuesday, October 15th, Dr. Jake Hagedorn, there it was, will bring some hope to the table in his presentation, Mitigating Climate Change, Using Science to Transform Uncertainty into Progress. He will analyze successful climate mitigation strategies already in place and investigate new, innovative approaches to addressing an uncertain future. In contemplating tonight's presentation, which will touch on the amazing, complex interplay between the biotic and abiotic worlds that make life possible, I could not help but think back over my 37 years of teaching astronomy and cosmology to college students. I've always been struck with how students react when they first encounter the vastness and complexity of the universe. For both students and seasoned scientists alike, the countless stars and galaxies that make up our universe are truly awe-inspiring, ultimately humbling, and I dare say, deeply spiritual. No less awe-inspiring are the myriad organisms and their interconnectedness that makes up Earth's biosphere. One big distinction between the cosmos and our own planet is that the first we can only observe. The other we can not only observe, but also manipulate and irrevocably alter. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jennifer Frick-Ruppert. She is the Dalton Professor of Biology and Environmental Science, as well as Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at Brevard College. She teaches courses in local biodiversity, animals and plants of the Southern Appalachians, and more. She is the author of 3 books, including the popular book, Mountain Nature, A Seasonal Natural History of the Southern Appalachians, which describes some of the most interesting plants and animals of the region. In tonight's presentation, Dr. Frick-Ruppert will address the local effects of climate change in the Southern Appalachians. News reports dealing with climate change usually focus on increased storm intensity and altered weather patterns. Dr. Frick-Ruppert will discuss a topic that gets less attention: how climate change is affecting the local biodiversity and its unsettling consequences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Frick-Ruppert.
Thanks very much, Bob, and I'm very glad to join you all here today to talk about climate change and its effects on biodiversity. As Bob mentioned, I'm at Brevard College, and I have been there for a long time. I'm in my, it's either 27th or 28th year, you kind of lose track as you go along that way. And one of the aspects that happens to you if you stay long enough is you end up in administration. Which is exactly where I am. So, to talk to you a little bit then about some of the aspects of biodiversity. When Bob first contacted me, this was back in the spring semester, to talk about, could we talk about climate change and how climate change affects biodiversity. I started doing a little research, scientific background, working in environmental science and biology. And one of the things I came across that really struck me, because it was a week like today when you have these heavy rains coming in, was this quote that, that came out from the North Carolina Climate Science Report that at the top. These recent soaking storms are no fluke either. North Carolina's first climate science report notes that extreme rainfall, including totals exceeding 3 inches per day, like many areas saw from Fred, that was Tropical Storm Fred that came through here, is becoming more frequent due to climate change. And that resonated with me because Fred, that tropical storm that came through in 2021, I'm going to reference this again a little bit later, but that really affected, we were up in Balsam Grove, we now live here in Brevard, but up in Balsam Grove, we ended up with 14 inches of rain over a short period of time that did an incredible amount of damage. And so to see that amount of rainfall in such a short period of time, really, I think people started paying attention. This is beyond what is normal, right? We're seeing these non-normal effects more and more frequently. And as I started preparing for this talk, a few other things really stood out to me. One was that down here in July, so just passing the couple months ago, we hit around the globe a new record of daily global average temperature. So this again, over the entire globe, an average temperature is higher than it's ever been, and it jumped up pretty dramatically. So you can see it was, in July 2023 was when it was highest, right? 17.08. Then on the 21st of July 2024, it jumped up by a little bit. And then one day later, that's a relatively enormous increase for a single day for the entire globe, right? So that's pretty dramatic when you start to look at numbers like that. Even though it seems like those numbers are small, it's average across for the whole globe. And now that it's summer 2024 has been the hottest already recorded, so again, we're on target to beat 2023, and 2024 is now going to be the warmest year that we've recorded. So all of these are just things that are in the news right now, active that you're hearing about. That seems like climate change is no longer theoretical. We're seeing its effects. So as I mentioned, where I found that very first quote, and you might be interested to learn if you didn't know already, that there is a report done for the state of North Carolina, issued in 2020 by the North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, which is over in Asheville. My neighbor is a scientist who works there. So his specialty is also in environmental area, and he works for them, as do several other scientists over there. They put together this climate science report, and it really looks at these 4 different areas: temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, and storm activity. If you're interested, this is the site to go get it down there. And that data set is published in 2020, so it's a 10-year data set from up through 2019. So 2019 is the last year that's inclusive there. So the information I'm going to show you in the next few slides, you got a couple of previews of those, is information that came from this report. So this is not me spinning anything. This is the information that's been published in this report. And if we look at observed changes in temperature, 2019, up until the time of that report, was the warmest year on record. That was the last year. We've already passed it. So in the 5 years since the publication of that report, every year after that has also been the warmest year of the report. The 10-year period prior to that, up to 2019, were the 10 warmest years in North Carolina history. And what we're seeing is a general trend where all 4 seasons are showing this increase in temperature. So that means that the length of the growing season is actually increased. Growing season being from the last frost date in the spring to the first frost date in the fall. And for the state on average, that's increased by a week and a half. If you look at the increase in the number of warm or very warm nights, this is nighttime, right? Those have shown a significant increase. And so what that means is that there's been an increased trend in the number of cooling degree days. Those are the days you have to run your air conditioning. So that's why I put the picture of the air conditioner over there. The number of days that you have to run your air conditioning has increased. And the number of days you have to run your heater has decreased during that same period of time. Now, one interesting note you'll see here on the bottom is that what North Carolina has not experienced is an increase in the number of hot and very hot days. Those are days categorized above hot is 90 degrees, very hot 95 degrees. And probably that's because we can't go up much higher on that upper end, right? So those very hot days have not increased. And we still have cold days in the winter, so we haven't seen a decrease in the number of cold days and night. What's happened is the space in the middle has heated up and stayed warm. So it gets warmer during the day, and then it stays warm at night. And so those of you who grow tomatoes will know that your tomatoes won't set fruit if it's above 70 degrees. So you have fewer opportunities to set tomato fruit, as an example, with those warmer nights. That also makes it kind of harder for people to wrap their brains around it, because it's not that we're now blowing the top out, that every day is now 100 degrees, 100 degrees, 100 degrees, except for it was this past summer. That's not part of the report. But in any case, it's not that those high-end days are really increasing, or we don't have snow anymore, although we have much less snow. Those either ends of the extreme are still there. We still get cold temperatures, we still get about the same number of hot temperatures, but the amount of warmth in the middle there is what's really increased. So those are our temperature observed changes. Temperature expected changes, so this is also in the report, what do we expect by 2050, and then what do we expect by 2100. By 2050, it's just an expectation you're going to see the same trends that we've been observing. So the average annual temperature in North Carolina is expected to increase. And the suggestion there is by 2050, it'd be 2 to 5 degrees higher. Very likely from a scientific perspective means yes, it's going to happen, right? Scientists talk in percentages, and what is the percentage like, how likely is this really going to occur? If a scientist tells you it's very likely or likely, they bet on it, right? They would take it to Cherokee and roll the dice. So very likely increase in the number of warm and very warm nights, because we've seen it. Very likely increase the amount of what's called summer heat index values, because that's where you're combining high humidity and heat. So expect that to increase. We're still likely to see an increase in hot or very hot number of days. So even though I told you that we haven't really seen that, scientists would predict that we should. And the likely decrease in the number of cold days, again, we haven't actually seen that, so that's why it's only likely instead of very likely, but scientists are still feeling pretty confident that that's something we're going to see. And these trends should be similar over that next period of time. I'm going to come back to some of this when I tell you a little bit more about what's happened just in the last summer in 2024. Okay? So that's the predictions. When you look at precipitation, again, looking at the changes that we've seen observationally, observed changes of what we've seen actually occur. And there hasn't been any kind of long-term trend that you can talk about annual precipitation that's averaged across the whole state. And most of that is because we have such since we're affected by hurricanes, we have really highly variable effects. And so 2018, in this report, 2018 was the wettest year on record in North Carolina, and that was because Hurricane Florence hit along our coast, bringing so much rain in that it really affected us, again, because this is a statewide average that we're looking at. What we have seen is an upward trend in the number of heavy rainfall events. That means greater than 3 inches in one day. And the 25 to 2018, again, remember that the data set ends in 2019. So the years just prior to the end of the data set had the greatest number of events recorded since 1900. And snowfall has been showing a general downward trend, except for in the northwestern mountains where it's been variable. And so this is just that picture that I included over there is Tropical Storm Debbie that hit in 2024 in August, brought a huge amount of rain along the coast of South Carolina, North Carolina. I grew up in Florence, South Carolina, which is in that little zone just above that area. I've got friends who are in Charleston. They saw a huge amount of rain and a lot of effects from that storm. So these are observed changes, and then they also have expected changes. So again, I just combined this here by 2015 and then continuing into by 2015, continuing into 2100. It's very likely that we'll have extreme precipitation events. That means both the amount that comes down, the intensity, and the frequency, how often they occur. it's likely that we'll see the total annual precipitation that will increase. And the reason for this is that temperature and precipitation interact. So as global ocean surface temperatures increase, then the surface that's right at the air surface that's right at the interface there is going to become more humid and hold more air. Sorry, the air is going to hold more water. The humid air will hold more water. And the relationship there is warmer air is able to hold about 3.5% more water per degree Fahrenheit. So what that means is more extreme precipitation is more likely because there's more water in the air to fall out of it. Right? So that's how that works, how temperature and precipitation work together. And again, these are some pictures that were effects after Hurricane Debbie down in around Fayetteville, where they had all kind of problems with many other effects, not just of rainwater coming down, but rainwater that then starts to affect tree stability. You lose trees, you lose power lines. There are many, many additional effects when you have heavy rainfall events. Sea level rise, another concern. It's been rising, sea level has been rising. And it's kind of interesting, it's been rising faster along the northeastern coast of North Carolina than along the southeastern coast. That's probably related to the shape of the land. We just see, and that's showing you how many scientific measurements are being taken across the state trying to track all this. And we're actually tracking a difference between the northeast and the southeast along the coast. By 2100, it's virtually certain. Again, remember me telling you likely and very likely, and now we've got virtually certain. Yeah, you take that one to the bank. Virtually certain that sea level will continue to rise, that storm-driven water levels that had a 1% chance of occurring in 2000 are expected to have a 30 to 100% chance of occurring at least each year. That is astonishing, y'all. That we're going to go from something that had a 1% chance of occurring to a 100% chance of occurring every year between 2000 and 2020 when this report was put out. That's a huge increase. High tide flooding is expected to be a daily occurrence for folks who live along the coast. Again, a picture from Fayetteville where you're going to expect to see this as a common daily occurrence. When there's high tide, it's going to be water across the roads. And the reason that sea level is rising is that first part, that warmer water warmer air holds more water, but warmer water also expands and occupies more space. So I put a little picture of a tea kettle up there because I've done this before myself. If you fill up your tea kettle too far, and then you boil the water in it, then it oozes out over the top, right? It's the water has expanded to occupy more space. Even there's a little line on that picture, I took that from Amazon, right? There's a little line that says, don't fill above this water level. And the reason for that is that as that heats up, it expands and takes up that space. So just warmer water occupies more space. But part two is that when ice on land starts to melt and then flows out into the ocean basins, it causes sea level rise secondarily. So there are two parts to sea level rise. And the biggest sources of that ice that's on land that melts are the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets. So as those start to melt, and so you see that picture there from the Greenland melt days in 2024, as that ice on land starts to melt and flow out into the sea, it's going to cause ocean sea level rise as well. So ice melting and freezing in the Arctic Ocean, and there's a lot of excitement and interest about the fact that we have open water in the summertime in the Arctic. That's a serious thing, but that's actually not contributing to sea level rise. As that melts and freezes, it's occupying the same space. So what about hurricanes and thunderstorms and winter storms? Globally, the intensity of hurricanes is likely to increase. Again, that's warmer ocean temperatures that's doing that. The precipitation that's associated with hurricanes is very likely to increase. You can't really predict, and just to be clear, you can't really predict the number of landfalling hurricanes. There's just too many other variable factors to say how many of them are actually going to hit the coast of North Carolina. but you can predict that the intensity is going to be greater and the precipitation associated with it is greater. And here's a great example, which was Hurricane Lee, that's out there in the Caribbean. It's coming up towards the coast, the east coast of North Carolina there. In September 23, it went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in 24 hours. Which is really an unprecedented rapid increase. And we're watching to see what's happening to the ones in the Gulf right now. That just is, I mean, it was named, it wasn't even named this morning. And it's expected to be a 3 or a 4 by the time it gets in Florida. So we're expected to see an increase, likely increase in the number of severe thunderstorms in North Carolina because we've got warmer spring and summer temperatures, likely decrease in the total snowfall amount, and probably in the number of winter storms that we have because of warmer winter temperatures. But again, you can't really, there's low confidence in being able to say how many winter storms are we going to have, how many ice storms are we going to have, how many hurricanes are going to hit North Carolina. There's just too many different things to try and predict. So you just want to be clear with what can be predicted and what can't be predicted when scientists are looking at these different aspects. And then from my last slide from this section here, from that North Carolina climate report, was about floods and drought and wildfires. And there is, again, a virtually certain increase in storm surge flooding from the coastal storms, including any hurricanes there. We expect likely increase in inland flooding because there's going to be more intense rain events. And then a likely increase in severe droughts, both in frequency and intensity, because of higher temperatures and increased evaporation. So one interesting aspect of this is that I've been talking about rain events that are going to be intense rainfall and bringing more rainfall over a short period of time, but the intense rainfall and might not keep up with how frequently that recharge is necessary in the groundwater, that it may just be that evaporation is pulling the water out so fast with the warmer temperatures that those sudden and intense rainfall events that then run off the land very quickly just are not enough to recharge the system, because those higher temperatures are going to continue to dry out the soil. So there's been a suggestion that we may see a likely increase in wildfire frequency because of the drought aspect. And so this picture is from 2016, was probably the worst wildfire season we had in western North Carolina. That was from the big fire that was over in Lake Lure and Chimney Rock area. That was there. We in western North Carolina were very dry that fall and just saw a lot of significant effects. And so that's, again, something that we expect to occur more frequently based on what we've been seeing from these reports. Right? So as I was working through this, as I said, got quite interested with here's what's been reported for the past decade up till 2020. So where are we now? And is there a way to keep up with what's going on now? And there is, for those of you who are data geeks and want to get into some more data information. We have also in North Carolina, a North Carolina State Climate Office, which is run out of NC State University in Raleigh. And they put out monthly blogs on what the weather is doing. So with the summer weather that we had this summer, preparing for a talk on climate change, I said, I've got to get into this and start looking around a little bit and see what's there. So I'm going to show you, these are some of the different blogs that are there, and I'll show you some images that I've taken from the blogs that were presented there as well. So here was June of 2024, and this is the precipitation summary, showing you the state of North Carolina. And so what I want to point out right here is this is 2024, and that does say first. That 2024 in June was the driest month ever recorded in North Carolina. And you may remember, I mean, we had practically no rain in this area. It shows you that here's the statewide precipitation. Average of the whole state was 1.35 inches. And that's almost 3.5 below an average for the 1991 to 2020 time frame. So significantly below, almost 3.5 inches below what would have been normal. So the time frame for this is, I'm not sure it shows you on here. I think it's on my next slide. It shows you the time frame goes back to 1940. So we're talking a long period of time. This is not just in the last 10 years. This is the driest we've ever recorded in the month of June. And the temperature during that month of June, at the same time, on June 23rd, Raleigh hit 100 degrees, and that was its daily record high. It was the first 100-degree reading there in the year, but only the first of 4 days in June that went above the 100-degree mark. And that's the first time that had occurred since July of 2012. This is June, not July. So the heat was coming much earlier than is typical, coupled with that very dry period of time. If averaged over the whole state, it wasn't quite as dramatic in terms of temperature summary. It's only the 22nd warmest year because it was being averaged over different periods. But some areas were significantly affected, and Raleigh was one that was hit pretty dramatically. So for Raleigh itself, that was the third warmest June that had ever been recorded, as compared to the state as a whole. And the precipitation was doing. So the different days of the month across the bottom here, the blue bars are precipitation, but the precipitation amount here is an inch. The highest point here is 0.3 inches. So nothing reached an inch. The highest precipitation is 0.3. This is for Greensboro, just one place that I picked out. And what you can see is that the highest temperature amounts towards this end were also the driest, right? Those two things were coupled. And so what that meant was something called a flash drought. So we had plenty of rain in May. I don't know if you can even reflect back to when May was. But May, that was graduation for us. We had a lot of things going on. We were paying attention. There was a pretty good amount of rain in May, so we were set up pretty well. And then we had June, where it suddenly got very hot and very dry. And by July the 2nd, so at the end of the month of June, 75% of the state was in moderate to severe drought. And 9% of the state was in the severest of severe droughts. So, as this says down at the bottom, again, I just cut and pasted this straight from the website, along with being perhaps the fastest emerging summertime drought in recent memory, it happened earlier in the season. So some other summertime flash droughts, we had these rapid intensifications, were in in July of 2010, in July of 2015, and in August of 2023, the year before. This is the first time it happened in June that we had that dry period. So this summer has really been a different beast, although not that different from 2023, but worse. So that's what June looked like. Then what happened in July? In July, we got some of the hottest temperatures that we recorded. So Charlotte hit 101 degrees on July 5th, and that was the first time it had been above triple digits or met triple digits. I guess you can go above triple digits in 2 years. And then some other cases, Raleigh again, notable, Raleigh got to 106 on that same day on July 5th. And so again, we're seeing that in July was the 9th warmest on record for that period of time. And July 21st and 22nd, see that little line right there, those were the global heat records for the highest temperature ever recorded across the globe. And we in North Carolina were feeling those same effects at that same time. Now luckily, we did get some rain in July. So that really saved us that we got this rain coming in these different periods. And some of the examples, we had 5 inches in Greenville on July 11th. That was the most that was recorded on any single day in July. On July 18th, Elizabeth City, that's towards the coast, had 4 inches of rain in one day, and that was the wettest rain since Hurricane Dorian, which was back in 2019. And in the Piedmont area of the state, Graham had about 4 inches of rain on July 25th, and that was the highest daily record it had had since Hurricane Florence. So again, that prediction that we made a little while ago about having more intense rain events, where there was more rain falling in a shorter period of time, really seemed to play out over these summer months. So those were predictions that were made in 2019 and 2020, and we're seeing the effects of those this past summer with these rain events. So that's some of the science there. What does it mean for the biology? What we've seen with hurricanes and storms is their intensity is significant. And two great examples for those of you who were here during that time. In September 2024, we had 3 hurricanes that tracked through here, Gulf hurricanes, that came up one after the next, Francis and Ivan and Jean. And Asheville was significantly damaged just by the amount of rainfall during that period of time. This is evidence from that storm that I talked about before, Storm Fred, which came through in August of 2021. It followed, there were 3 days of heavy thunderstorm activity, and then Fred hit, so that was 14 inches over a 4-day period. And Pisgah National Forest, this is a picture from one of the river crossings in Pisgah National Forest. Canton, Boston Grove, those were all areas that really were significantly damaged. And we're still seeing some of the effects of that. If you're hiking and out around Pisgah National Forest, we're still seeing some of those effects. So lasting damage, recreation impacts from Fred can linger for years. Recreation is significant. I mean, those boulders and trees were moved. It's impressive to go hiking along the Davidson River right now, and years later, 3 years later, and see that effect. But what did it affect biologically? The Davidson River is well known for its hellbender population. Hellbenders are already a threatened species, and they live underneath rocks. So rocks being picked up and rolled down the stream is not good for them, right? We know that habitat was destroyed there. The aquatic insects, again, are also in that area. They're at the basis of the food chain. They're found underneath those rocks. So those habitats were destroyed. And that would then directly harm the various fish species, the hellbenders, the aquatic insects, but it would also harm the ecosystem as a whole because those insects are what set up the food resources for all those other fish and hellbenders that are there. And I have to say, too, that these habitats are destroyed, but they're localized events. So it wasn't that the entire Davidson River was eliminated. There are still fish in the Davidson River. There are still hellbenders in the Davidson River. They moved and occupied different habitats. But probably, we don't know for sure, probably total numbers are down. And certainly they had to recolonize from an area that wasn't as significantly damaged. So headwaters areas are going to be much more affected than areas in lower, slower moving water because the animals could find refuge there. A few more examples of some local significant damage from that Hurricane Fred that came through, Storm Fred. This is Skinny Dip Falls, so well known to most people in this area because they love to go up there and go hiking. This is a before shot and an after shot, both of those from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service photos. I've always tried to put where those came from if they weren't already identified. And just to get you oriented, here's the same tree, so the tree was in both images. But that's what the fall looked like before. It's now been mostly kind of flattened out. You can see back in there it's just dirt. There's an edge there, and the big boulders that are down in the stream. So some suggestion of how significant that really was in terms of moving boulders, moving rocks, moving vegetation in the area. Again, still there, still got a stream, still moving. Animals are still in it probably. I haven't been there, but probably, right? But some pretty significant habitat change. Some other biological effects to keep in mind and think through as we're considering climate change is specifically related to insects. So an insect closely tracks warming temperature. So the temperature really determines how fast it feeds, how fast it grows, how fast its eggs hatch. So as temperatures increase, we're going to see eggs of those insects hatching earlier in the season. The caterpillar is going to grow faster because they're warmer. They'll transform into butterflies or moths earlier in the season. But a thing to consider is that birds migrate based on the length of the day. So we just transitioned into fall, right, with the equinox, the autumnal equinox, right? That's a day length change, and that day length stays the same from fall to winter to spring to summer, right? That change in day length remains the same. Birds are tracking that information to tell them it's spring or summer or fall or winter. And warblers are some of the species that we have here locally, many different species that we have here locally. They arrive on the breeding grounds at the same time every spring. Climate is not affecting their timing of their migration. Day length is affecting their timing of migration. So what happens is that it's called a decoupling. A decoupling, a breaking apart between the availability of the caterpillars and the warbler chicks that are raised on those caterpillars. So we've seen a decline in most warbler species, and I put there that's actual reported information. The number of warblers are declining, and it's also an expectation that biologists say there's going to be more and more of this effect as these two things start to get further and further apart. Because you'll note there that warbler is feeding its chick a caterpillar. It's not feeding it a butterfly. But if we talk about butterflies, monarch butterflies, well known in the area here, and there have been changes to their migration patterns and their overwintering locations. And this is relatively recent information that's got some of us as scientists really curious. So most of our eastern monarchs, and these are some pictures that I've taken, that picture on the top is actually in the back of my mountain nature book, from a monarch that was a local friendly guy. Most of our eastern monarchs fly down into the mountains of Mexico to overwinter in Oyamel fir forest. For some reason that was very hard to say. And in 2023, the survey taken in those Mexican forests showed a 50% decline in numbers from the prior year. And the numbers from the prior year were already bad. So having a 50% decline in that period of time is very concerning. Southern Florida has now been shown to have a non-migratory population of monarch butterflies. They stay there year-round. They don't migrate. In 2023, there was a 5-year study that showed that a population of monarchs now is overwintering on the sea islands of South Carolina. They stay in the coastal swamp area in the other seasons, and then they, in winter, go out onto these sea islands. And the hypothesis is that since those sea islands now are warmer and no longer freeze, they're really acting like the Oyamel forests do in Mexico, where the temperatures are cool and the humidity is high. And so they don't freeze, but they stay cool enough that they don't burn much energy to persist over the winter before they then migrate back north. They've also been shown to use an aquatic milkweed, which is a host plant, which is not too surprising, but a few other host plants as well, which is surprising. But there have been some shifts in the host plants that are actually being used. So not all of them are milkweeds. And this is the paper, a heading from the paper there, published, it says there, 27 June 2023 in Scientific Reports. So that's, again, relatively recent information discovered about monarchs not too far away in South Carolina. Now, I know some of you like blue ghost fireflies, as I do. And so what has happened with blue ghost fireflies? They're another kind of insect. And how are those insects been affected? Well, their emergence is tied to ground temperature. So what we see in late May or June are the flying adult males. And this is a picture of a male blue ghost from the back, dorsal surface. That's his ventral surface, belly surface. Those are his two little light organs right there. That's what glows. And those fireflies come on and they glow. They don't flash, for those of you who don't know. They don't flash, they just glow. They're in forest, not out in grassy fields. And it's the males that do the glowing and the flying. The females don't even have wings. They're wingless and they're on the ground. They occur in the southern Appalachians. They're specialists here. So we're lucky to have these fireflies and a few other really pretty neat species too. And my students and I have done some research on them. So we published a paper back in 2008, and when we published that paper, we reported their peak period of activity as June 1st, and that was a decade between 1997 and 2008. We're doing that work. Now I receive regular reports because I'm the Blue Ghost lady, so I get this information from folks. And I'm getting regular reports that peak activities around May 15th, and first reports are coming in late April and early May. So just in a 20-year period, 15-year period, we're seeing about a 2-week shift in peak activity. But that's not too surprising because when we wrote our report in 2008, the report that had been the scientific journal that had been published before that, scientific article that had been published before that was in 1965 by J.E. Lloyd. And he reported that in Mount Pisgah that the peak period was mid-June to mid-July. So we had already seen that shift. We went up there trying to find when peak was, and it was by the time we got there, which was the 8th of June in 2008, the peak was already over. We saw a few fireflies, but it was well past peak. So we had seen already a shift in there. And the same thing tracks with Mr. Lewis, who has a place in Cleveland, South Carolina. He's been reporting on them since the 1970s. And he's been able to show that there's been a shift in peak time as well. It's earlier down there because it's in South Carolina, so it's moved from around May 5th in 2008, which was the first emergence during the 70s. So we've seen that kind of same sort of shift in time. There are a few other interesting animals that are not insects that we've seen change according to climate change that have affected us here locally. I don't know if any of y'all have seen these. 9-banded armadillos. They used to be in Florida and Texas, and they are now here. And so they were first recorded in North Carolina in 2007. They've been dispersing northwards and to the east. They don't have much fur at all, and they have very little body fat, so they're not adapted to being in freezing temperatures, but they can dig into burrows, so when they get a cold snap, they can survive it because they've got a burrow there. They do eat insects. But back in 2021, Sapphire in North Carolina became famous for armadillos because they had this, I don't know if hopefully he's not here, this kind of crazy looking guy was going around in Sapphire shooting armadillos, trying to get them out of, because people were asking them to, because there was so much damage that was being done by their burrowing activity in the Sapphire area. And it made it into The Guardian in England and Wired magazine. It's all kind of stuff, it looks pretty cool with a guy with a gun and the night goggles on and stuff going on from Western North Carolina. I'm sure there was banjo music playing. But we have become known for having armadillos here in Western North Carolina. So the green counties that you're seeing there are where there have been confirmed observations. The blue counties that are down there are what are called credible observations, so that would be somebody who knew what they were actually talking about. And then the pink ones are where they're probably armadillos as well. So we've been moving across the state pretty dramatically in just a few years. Some global biodiversity effects for ecosystems and some species that have been lost directly from climate change. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia in 2024 had record high ocean temperatures, and we had a serious bleaching event. So that's a picture taken in it's in January, February, and summer of Australia in 2024, where the corals that should be colorful are all white. Bleaching is corals have organisms that live on the inside of them that help them, that is algae essentially, that help them absorb nutrients, absorb sunlight and make nutrients, right? Convert photosynthase. And they expel those organisms that live within their cells, and that's what a bleaching event is. So they lose their color because they're losing their symbiont. They're tossing out their symbiont because they can't support that symbiont anymore in those hot water temperatures. The symbionts become more irritants to them. So when you have a coral bleaching event, it's many different species that are affected there, and they've had on the Great Barrier Reef significant bleaching events in 5 out of the last 8 summers there. This little mouse down here on the bottom is famous because that is the first mammal extinction that can be credited directly to sea level rise. So this species was declared extinct in 2019 after a survey in 2016 failed to find it. It's called the Bramblecue mosaic-tailed rat. So not a very beautiful name, kind of a cute little guy, but now gone. That organism no longer exists on Earth because of sea level rise. And Bramblecue was a small island that was on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was affected by storm surges and then rising seas as well. So when you have rising seas coupled with hurricanes that have high storm surges, these small tropical islands get overwashed, and when they're overwashed, the organisms on there that can't survive don't. So here is an animal, a species, that has disappeared, gone extinct because of sea level rise. We have some closer to home as well. This is the first species that has been lost in the United States because of, again, sea level rise. And it is a tree cactus that's found in Key Largo. So it was declared in 2024 after, again, a series of hurricanes damaged it in 2017. Then sea level rise really kind of finished it off. This picture here is of a lot of little baby cactuses where scientists went out, collected some of the plants that had been knocked down and brought them back in and are trying to grow them in a lab. The Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden is trying to keep this species alive, so it's extinct in the wild, but is still in a tropical garden where it's being maintained as these very small organisms. You can see it's a tree cactus. It's a huge tree-sized cactus. And they've got some of the little baby ones they're trying to keep alive. There is another species in the same genus that occurs in Cuba and some Caribbean islands, and a few of those are still in Florida. But the Key Largo tree cactus, again, is another species gone extinct because of sea level rise. Thinking about how agriculture is affected too, with local biodiversity, those are also plants that we grow for our own use and resources. We've seen, like I said, an increased growing season. So we've seen an increased growing season. Around here, there's a lot of suggestion it's been more like 3 weeks instead of a week and a half is what I suggested for the state of North Carolina. But most of the old timers around here would tell you 20 years ago, May 1st was the, or May 15th was the date of the last spring frost. Nowadays, they'll tell you about May 1st. You can plant seeds. You can do it May 1st instead of May 15th. And the first fall date, first frost date in the fall is now, used to be October 15th. That's when you said leaves were really looking good. Now it's more like October 30th. So more like a 3-4 week period there. What we've been seeing, again, these are photos from eastern North Carolina this past summer during that drought, the flash drought that we had. We're seeing these summer droughts are severe, and we're losing productivity of crops. So there was a significant effect on the corn crop in eastern North Carolina this past year. We lost most of it because of the drought that occurred in the heat of the growing season. So a drought that occurs in August is not so bad because you've already got the growing crops, you've already, in many cases, harvested them, or you can harvest them. If it's hitting in June, that's the prime growing season, so they don't even grow enough to ever produce anything. So that's a significant and concerning effect on agriculture. We're also concerned about how our fungi and bacteria and insects going to change. Fungi and bacterial diseases probably will increase because we've got higher humidity, and especially in the spring and the fall. Maybe it won't be so bad because summers are drier and less prone to those effects. That's hard to predict, but something that people are concerned about, especially those of you who are agriculturalists. Insect damage to crops is also concerning because the insects we know are becoming active earlier and they're active longer. So how are those going to be affected? Again, I think we don't know the answer to that, but that's a concern. And if we consider our local forest and the plant species that are there, The amount of water that plants have available to them is really what determines their distribution pretty frequently. And the water availability is again related to temperature. Water that's frozen as ice doesn't transport nutrients because it doesn't move, and it'll physically damage the cells of the plants there. But drought conditions do the same thing. They prevent the transport of the nutrients. If you just think about the tropics, one of the reasons they're so diverse is because they don't freeze and they have high humidity and frequent rainfall. So you can get a lot of plant growth in the tropics. And one of the reasons that we in the southern Appalachians have such a diversity of plant growth is because we do freeze, but we have a high humidity and a lot of rainfall. And so we can end up having a lot of different plant species here. So having a lot more precipitation, having a longer growing season, you'd have to say those are positives for plant growth. But if we're having increased droughts and increased wildfires, that can't be a positive for plant growth. And we've already seen, I've shown you those examples of really intense rainfall events when you start to damage streams and hillsides and getting more and more of those damaging events from rainfall. And a question that I get frequently, especially this time of year, is what's the fall color going to be like? What can we predict for fall color? And I would say that, that effect, one of the things that we look for in fall color is, number one, if you have a good summer growing season, that's a positive for fall color. I would say this summer's growing season was poor because we had that severe drought in June. In the fall of the year, what you really want right about now are dry helps to break down the chlorophyll that's in the leaves and release chlorophyll so that you start to see those other pretty pigments that are available there. In the next few days, you're going to see it's not dry and it's not sunny. So that's also not good. And what really sets off the beauty of the color is a cold snap. So when we finally have that first frost, that's what really kicks it into gear. And so if our frosts get later and later and later, there are more leaves that are already off the trees and on the ground, and so the colors are not going to be intense. So I will tell you that every year in the southern Appalachians, we have very pretty fall color. Please come see the fall color. It's gorgeous. But I think this year is not going to be a great fall year. I don't think we had a very good setup this year. We didn't have, the weather right now is poor, it's going to get worse. The leaves are already coming off the trees, and the cold snap is nowhere in sight. And I have this tree that's on campus that I'm now predicting is going to be my predictor tree. The friend that goes walking with me knows which tree I mean. That tree just looks kind of sorry. It's kind of a reddish, pinkish, but it's not glorious as it often is. And so my prediction for this year is that not such a great fall color. So we'll see. That's my prediction. So I'd like to end here thinking about the animal that's probably most affected by climate change around the world is probably us. We really need to be thinking about people like construction workers that are out in the outdoors that are working in, this is just a picture from West Virginia not very long ago, September 2024, having to take a break so that they don't experience heat stroke or heat exhaustion. The picture up there is from a European paper, 7 deadly European summers based on heat waves that were in Europe in areas that don't even have air conditioning because they haven't needed it before. A heat wave in India, that picture was from 2022. India, 1 billion people present and at risk without air conditioning. So air conditioning, we're hearing more and more, is becoming something necessary to survive, whereas it wasn't years and years ago. So that is where I'm going to conclude with thoughts about how humans are not really separate from nature. The effects that we see in nature are the same effects that we feel. And I think too often we try to divorce ourselves and feel that we're separate from nature, whereas I feel that we're really part of it. And more often we think about our place in nature and how we fit in the creation of the world is something to consider how those effects occur and how we are affected and how the world around us is affected. Those two things are not different. So I'm happy to answer a few questions, got a few minutes, and talk about a few more things.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming.
Yeah, sure.
Can we keep you here till about 10 o'clock?
Depends on how much wine you have over here.
Well, actually, communion is a couple of days. We can talk about bees, because bees have to be impacted by what's happening.
Yeah, so bees, the question was about bees. And so it depends on what kind of bee you're talking about. So honeybees are one thing that are significantly affected. Honeybees are non-native bees. And so honeybees have been affected by many different introduced pests. There's some mites that have been introduced that affect them. And there have been pesticide effects on honeybees that have been pretty well documented. So there's something called colony collapse disorder. It's been around 10 years, but people have been really curious about it for a long period of time about what actually causes it. The bees essentially leave the hive and go. They disappear. And you come to your hive and it's empty. And my husband and I kept bees for years, so we would see this occasionally occur. So the number of honeybees are certainly declining. People are treating them for mites and trying to minimize pesticide exposure as a way to get around them. But I think one that's even more significant are the native bees that are alarmingly disappearing. And many of those, my understanding from my reading in scientific literature is many of those are also associated with pesticide exposure. That we're seeing more wide spectrum pesticides that affect those different, they're specialized on insects, but bees are an insect, and trying to minimize those, minimize their exposure has been negative. As we've increased the amount of agricultural crops, there takes more pesticide exposure, and the edges of those fields then get affected by bees. So I don't know that climate change per se, that I would say has a direct effect on either native bees or on honeybees. But both groups are declining, honeybee populations are declining, native bee populations are declining, and I think that's more a conversion of forest into agricultural fields and a greater use of pesticides.
Thank
Question here?
Well, it's kind of dovetailing on that. It was more about pest-borne illness.
Mm-hmm.
Like I keep hearing about more mosquito-borne illnesses. And then people want to treat pesticides to control those. Would that impact the bees as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about pest-borne diseases, in particular mosquito-borne diseases. And when you have more mosquito-borne diseases, you want to then treat with more pesticides, so there becomes a wider expanse of pesticides. I think absolutely that is correct. And absolutely that is of concern. Here in Western North Carolina, there are a lot of studies, I'm looking at Mary Arnott in the back, done on diseases transmitted by mosquitoes. My own child did some work in high school on mosquito-borne diseases. In Western North Carolina, we get them. There are more tick-borne diseases than there have been. And so, yes, there's concern about that. The problem is that in order to get rid of a mosquito or in order to get rid of a tick, you get rid of every other insect that's out there. And that's kind of a broad-scale response to a specific problem.
Can I just ask?
Yep.
So the warming will create more desirable climates? Would you
Warming
say?
should create more desirable climates, yes,
For those insects?
for those insects, yes. Mhm.
What you described here is upsetting, but it seems very gradual, like a few inches a decade of sea rise and slightly more longer climates. It doesn't seem, though, the seriousness which we've come to expect about climate change, like in 50 years, it's going to be an unlivable planet very soon. That didn't seem to be what you were saying at all.
Yeah, I sure hope not. That in 50 years, we have an unlivable planet.
Or 100 years.
Or 100 years. Yeah, I think the answer to that is the difficulty with understanding the geological timescale, right? We think that 50 years is a long period of time. 50 years is nothing in the history of the Earth, right? A change of something over 1,000-year period would be incredibly dramatic. if we're talking about significant changes over 50 or 100 years, it's unprecedented, I think, in the history of life on Earth. So again, I think that we perceive what's happening over a short period of time, 150 years. In the last 150 years, we've seen significant changes on Earth, yet the Earth has been here 4.5 billion years, and life has been here, what, well, 525 million years ago was a Cambrian explosion, and we saw all these different types of organisms develop. So it's a loss, it's an effect of organisms that have been here for millions of years that we're affecting over a 50-year time frame. And I think that's the part that's hard to grasp, to say, you know, we're talking about a few degrees of a shift, a sea level rise of a few feet, but how that is related to Earth as a whole is dramatic. I also think that, I mean, this is my own personal opinion, by the time things get bad enough, we'll be eliminated, and whoever's left behind us will be just fine. So I really don't think that Earth is going to turn into Venus, where there's nothing here. I think when the aliens finally get here to come visit us in another 100 million years, they're going to find all kind of really interesting insects that are very smart and running around doing some interesting stuff, but probably no big mammals, because we've just made the Earth unlivable for us. So I think again, you can focus on the beautiful butterflies if you want to think about beautiful things. You can think about the loss of polar bears, because we're losing those. But I think us humans need to think about what's happening to us too. How are we gonna persist for ourselves if we think that we aren't? But then that's my own opinion.
Is the Earth a living organism? In other words, it can protect itself. In other words, does it say, I have an illness, it's called humans? Or even go into the types of humans. Football season. So, can the Earth protect itself, like you were just saying? I just don't think humans worked out.
That sounds like the start of a great alien movie. We may have solved that with AI. Come back in a few years and AI, artificial intelligence, will have taken over, or will have gotten rid of the humans on Earth, and Gaia is going to be good to go. I mean, who knows? It's impossible to know, but I wonder what we are doing to ourselves. There was a question over here too.
Yeah, water, as in groundwater. And yes, as you're talking about droughts, I'm always concerned about water. How much do we have? I'm sure there's studies being done, but could you just touch on that?
Yeah, so the groundwater, we're removing groundwater at a pretty rapid rate. We here in the east have less problems with that than folks out west. So the aquifers in the west are the areas that are really being drained very rapidly. We tend to get more recharge, and we have more sources of groundwater, I think, as well. So I can't specifically address much more than that, other than to say, generally here in the east we're quite a bit better off than they are out west. But one of the interesting things that's happening is as we're drilling, as we're fracking, as we're removing materials from the earth, what we're finding is we're leaving voids, and those voids are then being refilled with chemicals, essentially, or runoff that then percolates in and damages some of that the groundwater. It also causes some different earthquakes. There have been an interesting series of earthquakes that are taking place in South Carolina that were associated with mining activities. So, it's kind of neat that it's kind of neat biology. You go in your geology class and you can talk about, hey, all these cool earthquakes are happening in South Carolina because of areas that have been damaged by mining activities. So, some different things going on. That's where I will stop, perhaps, with my explanations there. Follow up?
Oh,
Yeah.
you've talked about migratory insects, for example, and birds. you want to talk about human migratory patterns, especially as coastal areas become, and low-lying areas become problematic for living.
Yeah, we might have a lot of folks moving to western North Carolina. Everybody out the East Coast coming up this way too, right? Yeah, everybody from Florida. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're seeing sea level rise. I mean, if you've been to Charleston, South Carolina, one of my favorite towns, they've got flooding that they never had before, and it's a daily occurrence. And so, are they going to get tired and move up this way? I wouldn't be surprised. It's a little after 8 o'clock, so I just want to call time for those of you who need to get up and move. And but I'm happy to stand up here and talk some more. I've also got some of my books if you're interested. Mountain Nature is the book that I wrote in 2010 that's about seasonal natural history of the Southern Appalachians. Some of the pictures are from there. And I've also written a book about coastal cruising. My husband and I cruised along the coast of South Carolina and North Carolina for a while as sailors. And the book in the middle called Spirit Quest is about the Native Americans along the coast. I got curious as I was doing the research for the book on sailing. I really got curious about what the people were like. If I was imagining what the fish were like and what the trees were like and what the birds were like, what were the people like 500 years ago on the coast of North Carolina? I got curious about that, and when a scientist gets curious, they do the research, and then some of us end up writing books too. So that's kind of how that is. But I'm happy to stand up here and talk more about with you about anything, and it's been great. Enjoy it.